The opinion of the Gurubsar of the Vishnu Society, about the Surinamese ketikoti. After 1848, slavery in the Caribbean only existed on the Dutch and Danish Caribbean islands. This caused great unrest on the islands colonized by the Netherlands. Subsequently, a slave revolt broke out on St. Eustatius, and on St. Martin, many slaves fled to the French part of the island where they were free. As a result, on June 6, 1848, in St. Martin, a proclamation declared that the slaves of the Dutch plantations would be treated as free individuals. In St. Martin, the slaves were de facto free as early as 1848. Abolition of the enslaved was only discussed in Suriname in 1863, and then they were not even free as is claimed, but the slaves could only get rid of their position of slave after 10 years of state supervision. So, slavery was not officially abolished in 1863 but in 1873. In the celebration of emancipation, everything is grouped under the Surinamese ketikoti, broken chains. And the population of the Leeward and Windward Islands must accept this. No wonder that a large part of the Antilles and surrounding islands feel disadvantaged and second class and largely do not participate in the Surinamese ketikoti event, and rightly so. When the Netherlands finally abolished slavery, the slave owners were paid generously for their property, slaves, but the slaves did not get a damn. In Suriname, the Dutch government paid compensation of 300 guilders per slave to the owner as compensation for the lost property. Yes, you heard it right, a slave was the property of his master or mistress. In Curaçao, this was 200 guilders per slave. This was arranged through the compensation files. In the Dutch East Indies, the amount was 50 to 350 guilders, depending on the age of the slave. The slave owners claimed this compensation through lists of people they owned, the so-called statements. In total, the compensation amounted to almost 12 million guilders, about 10% of the government's expenditure in 1863. As a modern monk, Octenhove transcribed the slavery archives by hand in the National Archives. And whether it was done correctly, only Joost van Del knows. As an alternative to using slaves, contract workers in Suriname were recruited by former slave owners in the Dutch East Indies. These were the poor Javanese from Indonesia, the poor Chinese from China, and the poor Hindustani from India, who were called coolies by the whites at the time. At that time, the rule and divide system was already applied, so that the various population groups have the discrimination virus in their DNA to this day. One nation was favored and the other was not. In this way, the residents and poor overseas illiterate people were pitted against each other in a very devious way by the government that brought them in. That is why in Suriname and the Netherlands you still hear stereotypical slogans such as Negroes or Surinamese are lazy and stupid, and Surinamese have several wives, and then they only refer to the black Surinamese Negro population. But if you look back in history, you will notice that the white people were the biggest slackers. They did not want to get their hands dirty with the hard labor, so they first let the original inhabitants of Suriname work for them on the plantations with false pretenses, with or without force. When the natives turned out to be too weak for the hard labor, the Dutch started to buy Negroes from Africa from the black African rogue tribes to put them to work in Suriname and the Caribbean under appalling conditions. And supposedly having several wives is the responsibility of the Surinamese men. But who for over 300 years forced or not forced the African slave women, the properties of which physical intercourse was reserved only for the slave owners to have sex, to get more slaves? After all, in the beginning, the black male community was forbidden to sleep with black women. This was not allowed until much, much later, and in the meantime the white slave drivers celebrated orgy parties until they dropped. Over time, some of the white masters who liked to act as bulls regretted their misdeeds. To compensate for this, they gave the Creoles, their offspring, pieces of land, a better position in the labor market, and had a few undergo training as far as that was possible at the time. And as for the later Surinamese people regarding polygamy and the rule and divide policy, and so on, the people followed the example of their oppressors. These are just a few of the traumas that the Surinamese people have suffered from white domination. The fourth generation of Surinamese born from 1900 and the generations after have no right to celebration of the slavery past or apologies, because they have not suffered. Today they unjustly live like bloodsuckers on the backs of the non-religious ancestors who suffered and were slaughtered for centuries under the yoke of the former colonial rule. From the moment the Surinamese people switched to colonialism and adopted the religious teachings of the murderers of their ancestors, they no longer have anything to do with slavery and its past. In fact, the current Surinamese and others do not celebrate the abolition of slavery on July 1st. Rather, they celebrate the abolition of the cultural bond with their non-religious ancestors who suffered under Christianity in the name of the white God whom they now fervently worship. They have shamelessly broken the shackles of the past by entering the waters of the former colonialists instead of choosing the path of justice. They are fond of the rule and divide system of their former oppressors and are bound by the laws and regulations of the former land thieves. They feel elevated by the so-called democracy, which is organized distrust. Thus, those Surinamese have nothing to be proud of. In other words, the facts about slavery and the celebration of ketikoti are only a Creole event and have nothing to do with the abolition of slavery in essence, but rather with condoning Christianization and stroking their own egos. Have you seen how those revelers always behave on July 1st? They are dressed like peacocks and walk around perky, and I sometimes wondered where they suddenly got that pride from. While they sing all kinds of crooked songs at the top of their lungs and do their dances with great passion, most of them at the same time look accusingly at the white world, while they themselves are the most hypocritical creatures on earth. And the rest of the participants at home and abroad, as well as the current king and other dignitaries of the Netherlands, cry crocodile tears and make dumbfounded excuses to the Surinamese who do not deserve it. And those statements are made unsolicited in the name of the current Dutch people, which have nothing to do with the slavery past. Furthermore, the party droolers eagerly plunge into the idiotic festive bustle without thinking. Ketikoti is succinctly said the day of hypocrites. I can imagine that the ancestors who suffered, mistreated, and finally killed by the colonial system, who are currently honored and worshipped by the Surinamese today, logically through nature have pronounced the curse of the damned on those who do not deserve to be called offspring but must be expressed in one line with terms in which normlessness, mindlessness, headstrongness, and greed predominate. And that kunu, the natural punishment, is already well underway among the so-called slave descendants, which will continue for many generations until they are aware of the trauma they have suffered through all these centuries at the hands of their adopted God, law, and order. Collaboration, greed, selfishness, and hypocrisy are excused and intertwined with the Surinamese concept of ketikoti. Given the ceremony prior to their alleged feast, this is also done on behalf of the self-invented evil god of the white folks, their Masra Gatto who does not exist.
Saritoriëren.